Welcome to the Geros Health Podcast, where we make it easy for you to better serve older adults. This is the weekly Jerry on Ice segment that is a collaboration with the Institute of Clinical Excellence, the official Con Ed provider for the Geros community.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Jerry on Ice version of the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I am one of the two lead faculty for the Modern Management of the Older Adult course. Sorry that I'm jumping on here a little bit late. I manage multiple pages and I ended up on my stave off page, which I have done more than once, but this time I caught it early so that I was able to switch pages, and now I'm on the right page, at least for now. Please forgive me. I have a newborn at home. So today I thought we would do a little bit of an update. So we just started our next cohort of the Modern Management of the Older Adult live course. Dustin and I are going to be in Asheville, North Carolina, not this weekend, not Father's Day weekend, the weekend after, June 22nd. And then in end of August 23rd, I believe, we are in Camarillo, California. So we have some live versions of the Modern Management course coming up. And then we just solidified the next date for the next online cohort. So we are going to be starting our next round in September. So September 22nd is the official date for our next online cohort for the Modern Management of the Older Adult course. So if you guys are interested in jumping on in the fall because the summer is a little bit too busy, I encourage you to do that. Okay. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about clinical geriatric syndromes and frailty. So this is a big area of practice. Probably if you're working with older adults, probably a much bigger area of practice, or something that you see more consistently than you perhaps realize. So when we're talking about clinical geriatric syndromes, they're called syndromes because they're a constellation of signs and symptoms that have multifactorial influences leading to their presentation. So what do I mean by that? So when we are thinking about some of these clinical geriatric syndromes, and for example, we are seeing sarcopenia or age-related clinical muscular weakness, we are looking at frailty, delirium, we are like urinary incontinence, falls, and dementia. So these are probably the 6 biggest clinical geriatric syndromes. And because they have influences from multiple systems that are leading to their presentation, I would say that these 6 things are the biggest things that we are treating as physical therapists, especially in the older adults area, and especially when we start getting into hospital, acute care, skilled nursing facilities, long-term care, and home health. And so what is happening is that people will say to me, well, Christina, I kind of know when a person is frail when they come in. But if we as PTs, and I really strongly believe that we should be the leading practitioner outside of any medical management for these clinical geriatric syndromes, especially sarcopenia and frailty, because they are both related to physical dimensions of health. If we are trying to lead the way in how we are going to be treating these people, and that we have a role to play in improving the degree of frailty or the degree of sarcopenia that a person is experiencing in their later life, then we have to have a way for us to say, we went from this amount to this amount of frailty, or this amount of muscular weakness to this amount of muscular weakness. And so the question in the research world has been, okay, well, now how do we actually conceptualize how much frailty a person has? And that's been a really, really tough debate. So there's been 3 main ways that people have started to conceptualize frailty. And one has been the Tilburg frailty scale. The other has been Kenneth Rockwood, who's actually a Canadian, and his accumulation of deficits. And then we have Linda Freed's physical phenotype. And so all 3 have research to support them. So this is one of those things, like a lot of things in our ICE community, it's and not or. Oftentimes whatever is working best for your setting is the way that we're going to conceptualize frailty, as long as we're staying consistent. So the Tilburg frailty scale is a multi-dimensional scale. So when we're talking about frailty, people can talk about, so frailty's definition is relatively vague. It's an accumulation, a vulnerability to external stressors And so some people say, well, we have the physical presentation. That's the way that we're going to conceptualize frailty. But because the definition is so vague, people are starting to make almost subtypes for frailty. So they're saying, well, if we have somebody who has very low cognitive reserve and we can't necessarily put it onto a pathology, so we can't say, there's this beta amyloid accumulation, we're not going to give it a diagnosis of Alzheimer's per se, because there's other things going on, people may be kind of labeled as having cognitive frailty, so a lack of reserve in terms of their cognitive processing. The same thing can be said for social. So if people are doing relatively well physically, but they don't have any social supports, they're vulnerable because if something was to happen like a fall and they're in a rural setting, they don't have a lot of family around, sometimes it's 3 or 4 days before they get a visitor, that could be something that could make them very vulnerable to some sort of dive in their health because of that social frailty. So the Tilburg Frailty Index, depending on what way you're trying to conceptualize it, or for example, somebody in a multidisciplinary team may really enjoy using this outcome measure because it allows you to bring in other members of the team so that you're kind of working almost like a clinical geriatric assessment, the CGA, bringing in multiple practitioners for different parts of the scale. So oftentimes in like an acute care setting, you can kind of stratify risk based on subsection with that type of outcome measure. So that would probably be the best way that people would be using the Tilburg frailty theory or hypothesis. The second really popular way of conceptualizing frailty is the accumulation of deficits hypothesis. So this is Kenneth Rockwood's work, which says that the more issues that you have going on medically, either subclinically or full clinical conditions, the more vulnerable you are. So the more demand on your system, like in terms of like the risk for polypharmacy and the risk of hospitalization, et cetera, et cetera. So he created a accumulations of deficits scale. So he calls it the frailty index. And for that, he gets you to ask at least 30 questions pertaining to any aspect of health. So it can be, do you have hypertension? And you go yes or no. And if you go yes, then you get a point. If you say no, it's 0. And it can be, they want you to go through different systems. Do you have a hard time remembering things? Yes or no. Do you have issues with your blood sugar? Yes or no. Do you have problems navigating your community? Yes or no. Do you have a problem getting up a flight of stairs to get to the second story of your house? Yes or no. And so by putting all of these questions together, you get a composite score over a total. So you want to have at least 30 items. And if you have a score of 0.25, so if the person that you were talking to said yes to 25% of the items that you asked them about, then they would be considered frail. So this is a fairly hard cutoff. Some people have tried to make like a pre-frailty or at risk for frailty. Kenneth Rockwood doesn't really believe in that, and he believes that you can have larger degrees of frailty when people go into the 0.33, 0.4 on the composite index, versus they would be considered less frail if they're kind of right at that cutoff point. But who would be using this type of scale? So this type of composite index is often really beneficial for people in the hospital setting or even long-term care, because what you can do is with your EMR, you can create almost like a sheet that would be very standardized for intake. So they would have everybody's past medical history when they're coming in for some sort of inpatient, outpatient rehab program, for example. And the nice thing about it is that you can almost create, using an algorithm, just auto population of a frailty indice at the bottom, so that every person who's coming in, you're not explicitly creating a composite score for the frailty index, but because you're asking all of these questions already, you can create that index at the end. The other reason why a lot of geriatricians like this frailty index is because the questions aren't specific. So in terms of the relationship to different research questions, for example, we have a lot of aging prospective cohort studies that are happening in different countries. I know Canada has one, the US has one, and Britain has a big one that are still going on. But the way that they're asking the questions aren't the same. They're slightly different. And so you can still compare frailty indices in these big longitudinal data sets. You can also compare frailty indices across different hospitals in the same system, even if they're not using the exact same questions, because his idea, and it's been validated in the literature, is that eventually when you get into those, like that's why there's a 30 item cutoff, because as soon as you get into those larger number of questions, you're touching on enough of the organ systems, enough of the ADLs, IDLs, enough of the functional measures that you are starting to see that you can kind of get a pretty good idea of where they are in terms of the frailty spectrum. So the problem with this for PTs who are trying to conceptualize this is that even if they improve on every single ADL and IDL measure, the amount of change that you're going to see in a frailty indice is probably going to be relatively small, because you're not really you can say that a person has changed their blood pressure, but the odds of them going from hypertensive to not hypertensive or not needing medications for blood pressure is relatively small. So the instrument for measuring change with a frailty indice is not really that powerful. So if we are trying to conceptualize the role that physical therapists have in ameliorating frailty, we're not really going to see that much change with this type of index. And so that's why I don't really like using it in my research, because it's not really showing a person's ability to change or improve in regards to their frailty status. So then what is the way that we as PTs can really start to conceptualize frailty and start putting that in part of our, especially I think for private practice orthopedics, there may be a way for us to conceptualize the amount of frailties that we can almost do like what would be like workplace hardening, but it would be a strengthening program to increase resiliency and improve and optimize ability to live independently. This is kind of how my business brain works. What I tend to use is the physical phenotype of frailty. So this is Linda Fried's idea that, we don't really need to measure all of the organ systems. We need to think about the 5 physical dimensions. So we have weight loss, lethargy, weakness, slow gait speed, and physical inactivity. Those are the 5. And so she, in 2001, she put out a study called with the cardiovascular health study that started to break down, what these things were. So, did you have on the CEDS, there's a question that talks about, do you feel fatigued or do you feel like you have less energy to do daily things? And if you answered yes, then you would get a check mark for that physical dimension. Weight loss more than 10 pounds. There was a gait speed measure, which was, using a old outcome measure, et cetera, et cetera. And she kind of conceptualized these things. And so because she saw such positive results in terms of being able to conceptualize frailty by just looking at functional measures instead of deep diving into a lot of medical tests, she got a lot of response from this. And then she did a subsequent study that showed that this also, like the more subclinical and clinical blood markers, so that kind of in line with that accumulation of deficits hypothesis, the more likely they were to demonstrate more physical impairments on the physical phenotype. So she was able to bridge the accumulation of deficits and the physical phenotype ideologies together and show that, we're looking at the same thing here, and this is just an easier way for us to be able to do this in the medical system. So what is the problem with that? You think, well, this is great. We have 5 physical phenotypes. We can just throw them into our EMR, into our assessment, etc., and Bob's your uncle. The problem is there was a systematic review that was done in 2015 that was looking at how people have taken the physical phenotypes and applied them in their research studies. And this systematic review showed that there was 262 different permutations of these 5 physical phenotypes. So imagine that, so the weight loss is pretty standardized, but the way that we're conceptualizing gait speed, we could use the SPPB, we could use usual gait speed, we could use fast gait speed. Are we using a cutoff score of 1.0 meters per second, which is ambulation around the community? Or are we using 0.8, which tends to be a little bit more of a marker for loss of independence and institutionalization? Are we going to talk about physical inactivity during self-report? Are we going to use an accelerometer? Are we going to be measuring them over 2 time points? Are we just going to rely on memory? What if there's any cognitive issues? And so this is the the issue that is coming up with frailty literature, because we as a community of PTs, researchers, academics, medical staff are having a hard time nailing down what is exactly the best way. And what tends to happen is that we just use the outcome measures that either A, we are already using, and so we can just create a composite score from what we are already doing, or B, we are using things with the equipment that we have available if we're trying to implement a new system. And so the good or the bad is that a lot of these permutations of frailty, as long as they're conceptualizing them in the appropriate way, are showing sensitivity to change. So they're showing that with especially exercise programs, which is the frontline treatment for physical frailty. And it's been shown with level 1A evidence and systematic reviews that exercise is one of the best ways to improve resiliency and decrease the burden of frailty on an older adult population. We just need to be conceptualizing this in a very standardized way. So the one thing that I would say is that if we are trying to put this into practice, oftentimes we want to make sure we are taking an explicit gait speed measure. So what can happen with the SPPB is a 3-item scale out of 12 that's been very well validated in terms of clinical change and has a 5-time sit to stand, a balance measure, and a gait speed measure. But the gait speed measure includes the acceleration and deceleration component, so people can have a marked very low gait speed, but it isn't actually a low gait speed because it's not taking into account that people are accelerating and decelerating in that interval. So we should probably have a defined gait speed measure with an acceleration and deceleration zone so that we're getting an appropriate measure of gait speed like we would for any usual gait speed test. Doing one outcome measure and trying, especially a physical outcome measure, and trying to just say, okay, like there's a cutoff score of, after 12 seconds on the tug, over that you're experiencing frailty. It's too simple, with how multidimensional frailty is. And I fear that if we just use that, then we're not really getting at everything that we need to. It's like we wouldn't do one physical outcome measure to look at people's overall ability to live independently. So we can't really do the same thing with frailty. So you want to make sure that you are taking the 5 phenotypes and trying to ask questions or have functional measures related to each one. And so if you can standardize that in your setting and reevaluate that at the end, then we're really going to start seeing some meaningful change, and we're going to start seeing some numbers that we can use as physical therapists to advocate for our role and try to encourage the healthcare system to be looking at these type of interventions instead of just labeling a person as frail and seeing that there's a lot of negative health consequences to that. And so in the grand scheme of things, if you're in a multidisciplinary team, the Tilburg Index may be the best way for you to conceptualize frailty so that you can get all your teammates on board. In a hospital setting, the frailty index is probably going to be more common than the physical phenotype of frailty, just because it's easy to place into an algorithm in your EMR that is already doing a lot of the work for you. But as physical therapists, the one thing that we want to think about is how can we advocate for our role? And so Linda Fried's physical phenotype of frailty is definitely going to be that way, because physical inactivity we can definitely target. Muscular weakness we can definitely target, and slow gait speed we can definitely target in terms of improving 3 out of the 5 dimensions of frailty. I would also argue that energy, the fatigue and lethargy, we know that people who are more physically active are reporting higher levels of energy throughout the day. So we can probably target 4 out of the 5. The unexpected weight loss is usually a consequence of medical intervention, and we're probably not going to be targeting that one as much. But still, 4 out of the 5 ain't bad. And so what we're seeing is 0 of those 5 physical phenotypes is robust, 1 to 2 is pre-frail, and 3 or more is frail. And so we can definitely conceptualize that, place that into our practice, and use that as justification to our insurers about why we need to continue seeing these individuals and why we need to improve their strength in order for them to be able to live independently. All right, I hope you found that helpful. If you guys have any questions about the 3 hypotheses or theories around frailty, place them in the comments below. Otherwise, have a wonderful Wednesday. You'll actually see me on Friday. I'm going to take this hat off, put another hat on, and start talking about the pregnant and postpartum athlete. So you're going to see me again this week. And if you have any questions about the modern management of the older adult online course, you can also place them below or reach out to me through any of my platforms. Have a great week, guys.
Thank you for listening to the weekly Jerry on Ice segment of the Geros Health podcast. If you found this episode helpful, you should go to geroshealth.com to check out our course offerings that will make it easy for you to better serve older adults. Once again, that's GEROS health.com and click on the courses tab. Thanks for listening.